never thought I would see my parents again. Not after 20 years of silence. Not after becoming a mother at 15. And certainly not after building the kind of life they once decided I had no right to live. But there they were, Glen and Sandra, sitting in the courtroom gallery, heads bent together, trading quiet smiles like people who had already counted their money. They believed they had outmaneuvered me. They believed the law was a weapon they could aim at the girl they once threw away. What they didn't know was who that girl had become. What they didn't know was that their own attorney was about to cross that courtroom floor, look up at the bench, and say the 5 words that would turn their certainty to ash. "Good morning, Judge Johnson." Only in that moment, that suspended, airless moment, did everything they thought they understood collapse. People tend to imagine a judge's life as something linear, orderly, a clean path walked by someone who never had reason to stumble. They picture composed decisions and quiet mornings, a life assembled without mess or rupture. They don't picture a girl standing on her grandparents' porch in the dark, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping a plastic bag with everything she owned stuffed inside it. They don't picture a 15-year-old told, calmly and without ceremony, that she was no longer anyone's problem. But that was me, 15 years old, pregnant, standing 4 blocks from the house I grew up in, with nowhere to go except forward. And Glen and Sandra, my parents, were the ones who made sure I had no other direction left. If you've ever watched someone build something extraordinary from nothing, and I mean from absolute nothing, stay with me and I promise you, you will not feel a single one of them. It was a Tuesday night in November, and the hallway felt smaller than it ever had before. I remember the overhead light, the way it buzzed faintly, the way it made everything look a little yellow, a little sick. I was 15 years old and 7 months pregnant, and I was standing in the only home I had ever known, while my father set a plastic bag at my feet, like luggage left outside a hotel room. Glen didn't shout. That was the part I was never able to explain to people afterward. There was no dramatic scene, no broken dishes, no door slammed hard enough to shake the walls. He simply set the bag down, straightened up, and looked at me the way you look at something you've already decided to leave behind. "You made your choice," he said. That was the whole sentence. That was the entirety of what 20 years of being his daughter had come down to. I looked at Sandra. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, arms folded, eyes somewhere near the floor. Not on me. Never quite on me. I waited, I think, for something. A word, a flinch, any small signal that this was harder for her than she was letting on. Nothing came. She just stood there, like a woman waiting for a bus, patient and vacant, already somewhere else in her mind. I picked up the bag. I don't remember deciding to. I just remember my hand finding the plastic handle and my feet moving toward the door, and then the cold hitting me all at once. The kind of November cold that gets inside your coat before you've even buttoned it. I walked 4 blocks with one hand on my stomach and the bag knocking against my knee, and I told myself not to look back at the house. I didn't. Ramon and Teresa lived on Calloway Street in a small blue house with a porch light that was always on. I had been walking toward it my whole life without knowing it. I climbed the 2 porch steps and raised my hand to knock, and the door opened before my knuckles could land. Like they had been watching, or waiting, or maybe just understood that some things don't need explaining. Teresa pulled me inside without a word. Ramon took the bag from my hand. The house smelled like something warm on the stove, and somewhere in the back a radio was playing low, and I stood in their entryway and understood, in the way you understand things you can't yet name, that I had just crossed into a different life. They didn't ask me what happened. That was the first thing I noticed. No interrogation, no careful questions designed to extract the story piece by piece. Teresa simply guided me to the kitchen table, set a bowl of soup in front of me, and sat across from me with her hands folded, like we had done this 100 times before. Ramon pulled out the chair beside me, lowered himself into it slowly the way he always did, and said only, "Eat while it's hot." So I ate. After dinner, Teresa made up the back room, the one that had always smelled like cedar and old quilts, with fresh sheets and an extra blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She set a glass of water on the nightstand. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. When she turned off the light and pulled the door halfway closed, she paused and said, "You're staying." not as a question, not even quite as comfort, but as a simple statement of fact, the way you'd announce the weather. That was Teresa. She delivered love like it was information. The next morning, she drove me to my first prenatal appointment. She sat beside me in the waiting room with her purse in her lap and read nothing, just sat there, present and steady, a still point in a room full of noise. The doctor said everything looked fine. Teresa nodded like she had never doubted it. That Saturday, I woke up to the sound of Ramon in the backyard. I looked out the window and watched him work, methodical and unhurried, measuring twice, cutting once, moving through the morning like a man with nowhere else to be. By afternoon, he had built a crib from salvaged wood he'd kept in the garage for years, sanded smooth and sturdy, with a small curved headboard he had shaped by hand. He never mentioned it. He carried it inside, set it in the corner of my room, and went to wash up for lunch. That night, for the first time in longer than I could account for, I slept all the way through until morning. I lay there in the early light listening to the house settle around me, the distant sound of Ramon's radio, the smell of Teresa's coffee moving under the door, and something shifted in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like resolve, a quiet, non-negotiable understanding that these two people had opened a door for me that no one else had, and that the only worthy response was to become someone who deserved the opening. I didn't know yet what that would cost, but I knew I would pay it. Maya arrived in April, on a Thursday morning, in a hospital room where Teresa held my hand so hard I lost feeling in 2 fingers. She weighed 6 pounds and 4 ounces and came into the world without much ceremony, which felt right. We were both already practical people by then. I looked at her face, that small, serious face, and felt something lock into place inside me that has never come loose since. By September, I was working 2 jobs. Mornings, I was at the diner on Fuller Avenue, 4:30 until noon, taking orders, refilling coffee, learning to move fast through a narrow space without spilling anything. The work was not complicated, but it was relentless, and the tips were unpredictable, and I learned to read the difference between a table that would leave $2 and a table that would leave $5. Evenings, I restocked shelves at a pharmacy 3 blocks from the house. Quiet, methodical work that I didn't mind because it required almost no conversation and left my mind free to move through other things. Teresa watched Maya during both shifts. She never once framed it as a sacrifice. I studied after midnight. That was the only time available. After Maya was asleep, after the house went quiet, after my feet had stopped aching enough that I could sit still. I worked at the kitchen table with whatever textbook I was moving through, propped against a cereal box because there was no stand, no desk lamp, just the overhead light and whatever quiet the night offered. I drank cold coffee. I read the same paragraph 4 times when my eyes refused to cooperate. Some nights I got 2 hours of real studying done. Some nights I got 20 minutes before I put my head down, and the next thing I knew, Teresa was starting the coffee, and Maya was making noise from the back room. I learned not to look at the whole distance. That was the only way to keep moving. Don't measure how far you still have to go. Just identify the next thing and do it. The next shift, the next chapter, the next exam, the next morning. I built my life in small increments, the way you'd cross a river on stepping stones, committing your weight to one at a time, never looking down at the water. People sometimes ask how I managed it all. The honest answer is that I didn't manage it. I just didn't stop. There's a difference. Managing implies control and ease. What I had was stubbornness and Teresa, and most days that was exactly enough. I was 22 when a letter arrived that nearly undid everything Ramon and Teresa had built. It came on a Wednesday, official looking, with a property management company's name printed across the top in block letters. The language was dense and technical and designed, I understood even then, to be intimidating, full of phrases like notice of contested occupancy and pending title reassessment that meant very little on their surface but carried a clear message underneath: we want you out. A developer had acquired the note on the property through a chain of transactions that Ramon and Teresa had never been made aware of, and now someone with a briefcase and a timeline was suggesting that 30 years of their life in that house was negotiable. Ramon set the letter on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I spent the next 3 weeks at the public library. I went every day, sometimes twice, working through housing statutes and tenant protection codes and case precedents until the librarian on the second floor knew my name and my usual table. I took notes in the margins of a yellow legal pad. I cross-referenced city ordinances. I read about adverse possession, about proper notice requirements, about the specific procedural steps a property claim of this kind was legally obligated to follow. Steps that, as I documented carefully, had not been followed here. Not even close. I drafted the response letter myself. It was 4 pages, single-spaced, and it cited 11 separate statutes. I read it back 3 times before I printed it. The mediation meeting lasted 40 minutes. I sat across from the developer's representative and his attorney, and I walked through each failure of process methodically, without theater, without raising my voice. I had the citations tabbed. I had the timeline documented. By the time I reached page 3 of my notes, the attorney had stopped writing and was simply watching me. They withdrew the claim before we left the room. Outside on the sidewalk, Ramon put his hand on my shoulder. He was not a man who spoke in long sentences when short ones would do, and he looked at me for a moment before he said it. That's what you're supposed to do. Quietly, like something he had known for a while and was only now confirming. I applied to law school the following Monday. Not because of the winning exactly, but because of what I had felt in that room. The particular steadiness of having the facts, of knowing the ground you are standing on, of watching something unjust come apart simply because you refuse to let it stand. I wanted to live inside that feeling. I wanted to make it my life's work. 12 years is a long time to hold a single direction. There were semesters when the student loan statements arrived, and I sat with them at the kitchen table the same way I used to sit with Ramon's rent notices. Not panicking, just calculating, finding the next viable move. There were nights when Maya fell asleep on the couch beside me during bar prep, her breathing slow and even while I worked through evidence rules and constitutional procedure with a highlighter going dry in my hand. There were mornings I drove to class on 4 hours of sleep, and talked myself through the parking lot one step at a time, the way I had learned to cross that river. One stone, then the next, then the next. I failed the bar the first time by 11 points. I remember the number exactly because I needed to. I needed to know precisely how small the margin was, how close I had already come, so that the second attempt felt like a correction rather than a gamble. I passed the second time on a Tuesday in October. I was sitting at the kitchen table when the result came through. Teresa made coffee. Ramon nodded once, slowly, the way he acknowledged things that confirmed what he had already known. 8 years in family court followed. I took the cases no one wanted, the complicated ones, the ones involving children and contested custody, and the particular cruelty that surfaces when families come apart. I was not always warm on the bench. I was fair, and I was prepared, and I did not let sentiment override the record. But I understood, in a way I could never fully explain to colleagues, what it meant to be the smallest and most powerless person in a courtroom. I never forgot which side of that experience I had started on. The appointment to the bench came when I was 39. I did not call Glen or Sandra. The thought arrived briefly and then passed, the way certain thoughts do when you've already resolved them without realizing it. There was simply no one from that life left to call. What I had instead was Ramon, who wore his good jacket and sat in the front row. Teresa, who brought a tin of cookies for the staff because that was Teresa. And Maya, 23 years old by then, sitting beside her great-grandmother with her hands folded in her lap, who held herself together through the entire proceeding, and then, the moment they placed the robe on my shoulders, came completely undone. I looked out at the 3 of them and thought about a Tuesday night in November, in a plastic bag, and a porch light that was always on. That was the whole speech, really. Everything else was just words. Ramon went first, on a quiet morning in February, in the same bed he had slept in for 40 years. It was not sudden. His heart had been struggling for the better part of a year. but the absence, when it came, had a weight I was not prepared for. I handled the arrangements myself, the way he would have wanted, without excess or ceremony. We buried him on a Saturday. Teresa stood at the graveside in her good coat and did not cry, which was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. She lasted 18 months without him. I think she simply decided at some point that she had finished. She went to sleep one night in March and did not wake up. And when Maya called me that morning, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for a long time before I could go inside. I handled the estate myself. It seemed only right. I was an attorney, I had the capacity, and more than that, I was not ready to hand their lives over to a stranger with a clipboard. I pulled the documents, filed the probate paperwork, and began working through the inventory of everything Ramon and Teresa had accumulated across a lifetime of careful, quiet living. The house I expected, the savings account I expected, modest but steady, 40 years of small deposits made with the discipline of people who understood that security was built in increments. What I did not expect was the land. Teresa had inherited a parcel from her own mother decades ago, before I was born, before any of this had happened. She had never mentioned it. It sat in the county records under her maiden name, a clean title, unencumbered, in an area that had grown considerably in value over the years. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon, cross-referencing the deed records, and I sat back in my chair and looked at the number on the screen for a long time. When the full picture came together, the house, the land, the savings, the total stopped me in a way that very few things had. It was more than I had ever allowed myself to expect from anything. The will was unambiguous. Everything passed to me, sole beneficiary, no conditions. And tucked inside the envelope with the original document, in Teresa's handwriting on a piece of notepad paper, was a single folded note. For Ellen, for the beginning you were always going to build. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my coat pocket, close to my chest, where I have kept it ever since. The letter arrived 6 weeks after Teresa's funeral, certified mail, delivered to my office on a Wednesday afternoon while I was between hearings. My clerk set it on my desk with the careful neutrality of someone who had read the return address and made a reasonable inference. I finished the case notes I was working on before I opened it. I have always believed that bad news deserves the same composure as any other kind. The filing was 14 pages. Glen and Sandra had retained an attorney, someone from a firm I didn't recognize, based 2 counties over, and the claim was structured with enough legal scaffolding to suggest the attorney was competent, if not particularly imaginative. The core argument ran along 3 lines. That the land Teresa had inherited carried an implicit family interest by virtue of long-standing familial association. That Ramon and Teresa's testamentary wishes could be challenged on the grounds of undue influence, and that the estate had been improperly structured to exclude rightful heirs. That last phrase, rightful heirs, appeared 4 times in 14 pages. I counted. I read the filing once straight through, then read it again from the beginning. The legal arguments were not strong. I could see the seams in them, the places where the reasoning required the reader to accept an unsupported premise and move on quickly before the gap became obvious. A competent attorney would find those seams without difficulty. The undue influence claim in particular would not survive scrutiny. I had handled enough contested estates to know exactly what that standard required, and exactly how far this filing fell short of meeting it. What the filing was, underneath the legal language, was an act of recognition. Glen and Sandra had seen Teresa's obituary, or someone had told them, or they had found the probate filing in the county records, which are public, and they had done the arithmetic. They had calculated the value of what Teresa left behind, weighed against 20 years of silence, and decided that the silence was not disqualifying. That whatever they had forfeited by walking away from a 15-year-old girl on a November night did not preclude them from a share of what that girl had been given by the people who stayed. I set the filing down on my desk. I sat with it for a moment, not with anger exactly, something quieter than anger, something closer to clarity. Then I picked up my phone and called my clerk. "Clear my Thursday," I said. "I have something to prepare." I pulled out a fresh legal pad, uncapped my pen, and got to work. The hearing was assigned to courtroom 7 on a Thursday morning in April, which struck me as fitting. Maya had been born in April, and most of the things that had permanently altered the shape of my life seemed to arrive in that month, as if the calendar had a preference. I dressed the same way I always dressed for the bench. Robe pressed, hair back, the small silver pin Teresa had given me years ago, fastened at the collar where no one could see it but me. I reviewed my docket notes one final time in my chambers, set them in order, and waited for the clerk's knock. Glen and Sandra had not asked who the assigned judge was. I knew this because the clerk's office had processed no inquiry, and because when I reviewed the procedural record in preparation, there was no indication that opposing counsel had done even the most basic background work on the courtroom they were walking into. It was a simple oversight, the kind that happens when an attorney is confident enough in the merits of a case or the perceived weakness of the opposing party that due diligence feels like an unnecessary formality. It was the kind of oversight that changes everything. I heard the courtroom from the hallway, the low ambient noise of a room settling into readiness, chairs adjusting, papers moving. Their attorney was already speaking when I entered, mid-sentence in a remark directed at the clerk's desk, the easy conversational tone of a man who felt at home. He turned toward the bench as I came through the door, reflexive and professional, and I watched the precise moment his sentence stopped. It lasted half a beat, no more than that. Then, because he was competent and composed and understood that the only thing to do was proceed, he said it clearly and without inflection. "Good morning, Judge Johnson." I heard Glen's chair move. I did not look at him yet. I set my docket on the bench, adjusted my notes, and allowed the room a moment to complete whatever internal reckoning it needed to complete. Sandra's hand had found the edge of the table. I registered this in my peripheral vision, that small, involuntary reach for something solid. I had thought, in the weeks of preparation leading to this morning, that I might feel something large when this moment arrived. Triumph, perhaps, or the particular satisfaction of a circle closing. What I felt instead was very quiet, settled. The way you feel when you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you were built to do. I looked down at my docket. "We're on the record," I said. "Let's begin." The ruling took 11 minutes. I had written it over the course of 2 evenings, the same way I had written everything that mattered in my life, at a kitchen table, after the noise settled, with full attention and no shortcuts. The legal deficiencies in their claim were not difficult to enumerate. The undue influence argument collapsed against the documentary record. The family interest theory had no statutory foundation. The improper structuring allegation required a set of facts that did not exist. I ruled for the estate. I ruled for Teresa's handwriting on a piece of notepad paper. I ruled for the beginning I was always going to build. Glen and Sandra left without looking at the bench. I waited 3 days before I wrote the note. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to be sure I was writing it for the right reason. Not from anger trying to disguise itself as resolution. Not from a need to witness their diminishment up close. I wrote it by hand, 4 sentences, asking if they wanted to meet. I left the decision entirely to them. They responded within 24 hours. That told me something, though I wasn't sure yet what. We met on a Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. I arrived first and chose a corner table, which was habit. They came in together, Glen holding the door for Sandra, and I watched them cross the room before they saw me. 2 people in their late 60s, moving carefully, wearing the particular expression of people who have rehearsed something and are no longer confident in the material. They were smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing. Not physically exactly, but in some more fundamental way, as if the version of them I had carried for 20 years had been built to scale with my fear, and the actual people in front of me were simply unable to fill it. We sat for 40 minutes. Glen spoke more than Sandra. There was no clean apology, nothing that arrived in that shape, but there was something else, something harder to name, a tiredness, an acknowledgement that moved through the conversation like a current beneath the surface, never quite breaking through, but present in every careful sentence. I did not perform forgiveness. I did not tell them it was fine. I listened. I said what was true, And when it was over, I stood up and wished them well, and meant it, which surprised me. I drove home and called Maya and told her to pack a bag for the weekend. That evening, I made Ramon's rice from memory, the proportions he had never written down but somehow I had kept, and ate it at the kitchen table where I had studied past midnight for years, in the house Teresa had left me, in the life I had built from a plastic bag and a porch light, and 2 people who opened a door before I could knock. I did not forgive Glen and Sandra. Forgiveness felt like something they needed, and I had stopped organizing my life around their needs a long time ago. What I did instead was simpler and more permanent. I put them down. Set them on the ground like a bag I had been carrying since I was 15 years old, and walked forward without them. I have not picked them up since.